At 2:31 in the morning on June 6, 1996, a 911 dispatcher in Rowlett, Texas, received a call that would become one of the most analyzed pieces of audio evidence in American true crime history. On the other end of the line, a woman was screaming. Her words came out in a desperate rush. "Oh my God, my babies are dying. Someone came in while we were asleep and stabbed my babies. I woke up and my babies are dying. They are gone. Oh my God." The voice belonged to Darlie Routier, a 26-year-old mother calling from her upscale suburban home on Eagle Drive, one of the nicest streets in this quiet Dallas suburb. Rowlett was the kind of place where people moved specifically to raise their children safely, where neighbors knew each other's names, where violent crime was something you saw in the news from other places, never in your own backyard. When police arrived 3 minutes later, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. The family room looked like something from a horror movie. Blood covered the carpet, the walls, the furniture. 2 little boys, 6-year-old Devin and 5-year-old Damon, had been stabbed to death. And their mother, Darlie, was bleeding from wounds to her throat and arm, claiming an intruder had done this terrible thing before vanishing into the night like smoke. The responding officers had never seen anything like it. Most of them had children of their own. Looking at those 2 small bodies, seeing the sheer violence that had been inflicted on them, shook even the most experienced investigators to their core. But here's what makes this case different from every other home invasion story you've ever heard. The blood evidence would tell 2 completely different versions of what happened that night. One version supported Darlie's story of a random intruder breaking into their home. The other version suggested something so horrifying, so unthinkable, that most people didn't want to believe it was possible. That a mother had ended her own children's lives. This is the story of how forensic science became both the prosecution's strongest weapon and the defense's last hope. And nearly 30 years later, the debate about what really happened that night is still tearing people apart. The Routiers seem to have it all. Darren Routier was a successful computer entrepreneur, pulling in close to $300,000 a year. His wife, Darlie, was beautiful, with platinum blonde hair and a wardrobe full of expensive clothes. They lived in a pristine 2-story home in one of Rowlett's nicest neighborhoods, complete with a boat and jet skis parked outside. Their 3 sons were the center of their world. Devin was 6, smart and sweet. Damon was 5, energetic and always laughing. And baby Drake was just 7 months old, still tiny and helpless. To anyone looking at them from the outside, the Routiers were living the American dream. But money has a way of creating problems, even when you have plenty of it. Darren's business was starting to struggle. The bills were piling up, and Darlie, who'd once worked as a nurse, was now a stay-at-home mom, drowning in the endless demands of 3 young children. On the night of June 5th, 1996, everything seemed normal. The family ate dinner together. The boys watched television in the downstairs family room while their parents got ready for bed. Around 10 p.m., Darlie decided to sleep downstairs on the couch with Devin and Damon. Darren went upstairs to bed with baby Drake sleeping in a crib nearby. It was the last time this family would ever be together. According to Darlie's account, she woke up around 2:30 a.m. to Damon saying, "Mommy." She opened her eyes and immediately felt pressure on her body. In the darkness, she could make out a figure. A white male, she'd later tell police. About 6 feet tall, dressed in dark clothing and a baseball cap. He was on top of her. She said she fought with this intruder. During the struggle, she felt something sharp cut across her throat and arm, but she didn't even register the pain at first. The man dropped the knife he'd been holding and ran toward the garage. Darlie claimed she followed him, watched him disappear through a cut screen in the garage, then turned back toward the family room. That's when she saw her children. Devin was lying perfectly still, not breathing. Damon was trying to crawl across the floor, leaving a horrific trail of blood behind him on the carpet. Darlie ran to pick up the knife the intruder had supposedly dropped, a 10-inch blade from her own kitchen, and only then did she notice she was bleeding heavily from her neck. She grabbed towels. She screamed for Darren. She called 911. And then she waited, performing CPR on her dying children while the dispatcher stayed on the line. The 911 call lasted 5 minutes and 43 seconds. And investigators would spend years analyzing every single word, every breath, every background sound on that recording. When officers arrived at the scene, they found Darlie in the family room, covered in blood. Devin was already gone. Damon was still alive, but barely. He'd end up passing away in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. And right away, something felt off to the responding officers. Darlie's story was that an intruder had cut the screen in the garage, entered through that window, taken a knife from her kitchen, attacked her and her children, then fled back through the garage. But when investigators looked at that cut screen, they noticed something strange. The windowsill had a thick layer of dust on it, completely undisturbed. Nobody had climbed through that window. The mulch in the flower beds outside the garage window was also pristine. No footprints, no disturbance. No sign that anyone had jumped down from that window and run away. Inside the garage, there were no blood drops, none. If someone had just ended the lives of 2 children and attacked their mother, they'd be covered in blood. They'd be running, panicked, desperate to escape. There should have been blood drops, blood smears, blood trails, but there was nothing. The only piece of evidence found outside the Routier home was a blood-soaked sock discovered 75 yards away in an alley. When tested, the sock contained blood from both Devin and Damon. This seemed to support Darlie's story. Surely an intruder must have taken it during his escape, right? Except the police bloodhounds couldn't track any scent beyond where that sock was found. And 75 yards is a lot of distance to cover from the house. Think about that for a second. If you're an intruder who just stabbed 2 children to death, why are you running 75 yards down an alley to dump a sock? Why not just drop it and keep running? As investigators processed the scene more thoroughly, more problems with Darlie's story began to emerge. Problems that started small but grew into mountains of doubt. The most valuable jewelry in the house was still sitting out in plain sight. Nothing had been stolen. Not the jewelry, not the purse, not any electronics. What kind of burglar breaks into a home, attacks a family with a knife from their own kitchen, and leaves without taking anything? Then there was the issue of Darlie's injuries. She had a slash across her throat that doctors said came within 2 millimeters of her carotid artery. She had cuts on her arms. The wounds looked serious, and Darlie insisted they'd been inflicted by the intruder during their struggle. But here's what bothered the emergency room doctors and nurses. Darlie's wounds were remarkably shallow and precise for someone who'd supposedly been in a life-or-death fight with an intruder. They didn't see the defensive wounds you'd typically find on someone fighting off an attacker. They didn't see random slashes and gouges. They saw controlled, almost deliberate cuts. One nurse would later testify that when she was treating Darlie in the hospital, Darlie was more concerned about when she could get her nails done than she was about her murdered children. Another nurse reported that Darlie asked if she could have her breasts examined because she'd been thinking about getting implants. Who thinks about cosmetic surgery hours after their children have been ended? But none of this. Not the missing evidence, not the strange behavior, not the inconsistencies, was as damning as what the blood spatter experts were about to discover. Forensic investigators analyzed every single drop, smear, and spatter of blood in that house. And what they found was a story written in crimson, a story that contradicted Darley's version of events in almost every way. The blood drops on the kitchen floor were perfectly circular. This is basic physics. When you're standing still or walking slowly, your blood drips straight down and makes round drops. But when you're running, when you're chasing someone in a panic, your blood creates elongated drops with tails pointing in the direction you're moving. It's the same principle as water dripping from a moving car. Darley had claimed she chased the intruder through the house while bleeding from her wounds. But the blood drops didn't show any movement at all. They were textbook examples of blood falling from a stationary or slow-moving source. This meant Darley wasn't running or chasing anyone. She was walking slowly, methodically, through her house while blood dripped from her injuries. Then there was the murder weapon. Darley said the intruder dropped the knife on the kitchen floor during their struggle. When you drop a blood-covered object, it creates a distinctive pattern. Blood spatters from the impact, creating radiating lines and secondary droplets. It's called impact spatter. But forensic experts couldn't find any evidence that a blood-covered knife had been dropped there. No blood outline, no spatter pattern from the impact, nothing that suggested the knife had fallen from any height onto that floor. The knife had been placed there, not dropped. When investigators sprayed luminol, a chemical that makes blood glow blue even after it's been cleaned up, they found Darley's footprints in front of the kitchen sink. The luminol showed where someone had tried to wipe away blood before police arrived. Darley had stood at that sink for a significant amount of time, bleeding steadily enough to create pools of blood that she later attempted to clean. But the most damning piece of evidence was found on Darley's nightshirt, the white nightshirt she'd been wearing during the attack. Blood spatter analyst Charles Lynch examined the shirt under microscopic detail. On the back right shoulder, he found tiny droplets of blood. When he tested these droplets, he discovered they belonged to Devon and Damon, not Darley, her children. And the pattern of these droplets told a very specific story. They were cast-off blood spatter, the kind that flies off a knife blade when you're swinging it backward between stabs. The upward angle of the droplets suggested the knife was being raised above someone's head, then brought down with force. Think about what that means. Those droplets could only have gotten on the back of Darley's nightshirt if she was the one holding the knife, if she was the one stabbing her children. But wait, there's more. Investigators found something else that blew Darley's story apart. There was a bread knife in the Routier's kitchen knife block. On its blade, forensic scientist Charles Lynch discovered tiny particles of fiberglass and rubber dust. When he compared these materials to the cut screen in the garage, they matched perfectly. This meant that the bread knife, which should have been sitting unused in the kitchen all night, had been used to cut that screen. The screen that was supposedly cut by an intruder to break into the home. An FBI behavioral specialist reviewed all the evidence and declared the crime scene staged. And here's why. No intruder would break into a home, go to the kitchen and take a knife, go back outside to cut a screen, then come back inside to commit violence. That makes no sense. Those elaborate, unnecessary steps could only mean one thing. Someone inside the house was trying to make it look like an intruder had broken in. Based on all this evidence, prosecutors built a theory of what really happened that night. And it's a theory that still makes people uncomfortable nearly 30 years later. They believe Darley had been overwhelmed by the pressures of motherhood and marriage. The money problems were mounting. Her husband was barely home. She was isolated, exhausted, resentful. The children had become obstacles to the life she wanted, the life she'd had before becoming a full-time mother to 3 demanding boys. So she'd planned it. She'd encouraged Devin and Damon to sleep downstairs with her that night. Sometime after 2 a.m., she'd taken the bread knife to the garage and cut the screen to make it look like a break-in. The fiberglass residue on the blade proved this. Then she'd returned to the family room with the large kitchen knife and stabbed her sleeping children. The blood spatter on her nightshirt placed that weapon in her hand. She may have removed her own underwear to suggest a sexual assault, adding another layer to her story. At the kitchen sink, Darlie had turned the knife on herself, carefully inflicting wounds to her neck and arm that looked serious but weren't life-threatening. But 5-year-old Damon wasn't gone yet. He was crawling across the floor, fighting for his life with every ounce of strength in his small body. In that moment, prosecutors theorized. Darlie made a cold calculation. She stabbed Damon 2 more times to ensure he couldn't survive to tell what really happened. Then she ran that sock 75 yards down the alley, creating evidence of an intruder. She cleaned up some of the blood at the sink. She staged other elements of the scene. And only then did she call 911, her voice filled with what prosecutors called manufactured panic. 8 days after the attacks, the Routiers held a birthday party at the cemetery. It would have been Devin's 7th birthday. They invited television cameras to record the event. The footage shows Darlie and other family members spraying silly string on Devin's grave. They're smiling, laughing, singing happy birthday. It's hard to watch, even now. Because regardless of what you believe about Darlie's guilt or innocence, it's jarring to see a mother seemingly celebrating at her child's grave just days after his brutal death. The prosecution played this silly string video for the jury. They argued it showed a woman who wasn't really grieving, a woman who was performing grief rather than feeling it. Darlie's defenders point out that the video only showed a 2-minute clip of silly string spraying. It didn't show the 2 hours before that, when Darlie and her family had prayed and cried at the graveside. It didn't show the context, but the damage was done. The jury had seen that footage, and they couldn't unsee it. In February 1997, Darlie Routier went on trial for the ending of her 5-year-old son, Damon. She was also charged with Devin's death, but has never been tried for that case separately. The prosecution presented their mountain of forensic evidence: the blood spatter, the fiberglass on the bread knife, the luminol showing cleaned up blood, the lack of evidence for an intruder, the silly string video. Darlie took the stand in her own defense, and by all accounts, it didn't go well. The jury found her defensive, argumentative, and lacking in emotion. When asked about her murdered children, she seemed more concerned with clarifying details than expressing grief. Her defense team argued that an intruder could have committed these crimes. They pointed to that bloody sock found 75 yards away. How could Darlie have run that distance, bleeding from her wounds, and gotten back to the house in time to make the 911 call? They argued her injuries were too severe to be self-inflicted. They presented their own experts who challenged the prosecution's blood spatter analysis. But it wasn't enough. On February 4, 1997, the jury found Darlie Routier guilty of capital offense. The same jury recommended she be sentenced to death. She was 27 years old. As of 2024 to 2025, Darlie Routier remains on death row in Texas at the Patrick L. O'Daniel unit. She is now 55 years old, a far cry from the platinum blonde young mother who made headlines nearly 3 decades ago. Here's what's happened in the years since her conviction. Darlie and Darren Routier divorced in 2011. They'd stayed together for 15 years after her conviction, with Darren visiting her every 3 weeks without fail. But eventually, they decided to end what Darren called the limbo they'd been living in. Despite the divorce, Darren still insists his ex-wife is innocent. He's never wavered in his belief that an intruder was responsible for their sons' deaths. Their surviving son, Drake, who was just 7 months old when his brothers were ended, is now approximately 29 years old. Darren raised him away from the media spotlight, protecting him from the circus that his mother's case became. By all accounts, Drake is a well-adjusted adult who occasionally visits his mother on death row. But the most significant development in Darlie's case has been the ongoing DNA testing. And this is where things get really interesting. Since 2018, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals has ordered multiple rounds of DNA testing on evidence from the crime scene. Advanced DNA technology that wasn't available during the original trial has now been applied to dozens of pieces of evidence. Testing has been conducted on the bloody sock found 75 yards from the house, hair samples recovered from the sock, Darlie's nightshirt, blankets and pillowcases from the scene, fingernail clippings from the children, the murder weapon, various blood samples from throughout the house. As of 2024 to 2025, the results of the most recent round of DNA testing are still pending. Some preliminary results have been revealed over the years, but they've been inconclusive or have only confirmed DNA from Darlie and her children. However, and this is crucial, there are two pieces of evidence that don't match anyone from the Routier family or the investigators. A fingerprint was found on the windowsill in the garage, and a bloody fingerprint was discovered on the coffee table. Neither of these prints has ever been matched to a known person. Darlie's defense team argues these unidentified prints prove an intruder was present. The prosecution counters that the prints could have come from anyone who visited the house before the attacks, and blood could have been transferred to them during the chaos of the crime scene. The DNA testing has created a new wave of attention for Darlie's case. Multiple documentaries have examined her story. ABC's The Last Defense in 2018 devoted a 4-part series to her case. ABC's 2020 aired a 2-part special in 2019. ITV's Death Row's Women with Susanna Reid featured a face-to-face interview in 2000. Unsolved Mysteries featured her case. Multiple other true crime shows and podcasts have covered the story. Here's where this case gets really complicated. There are millions of people who believe Darlie Routier is innocent. Not just family members, actual legal experts, journalists, and everyday people who've studied the case and come away convinced she was wrongfully convicted. They point to several things. First, the bloody sock. How did it get 75 yards away if Darlie committed these crimes? The timeline doesn't make sense. From the attack to the 911 call was only a matter of minutes. How did she have time to run 75 yards down an alley and back while bleeding from a throat wound? Second, her injuries. Doctors have said her throat wound came within 2 millimeters of her carotid artery. Would someone really cut themselves that close to a fatal injury? Third, those unidentified fingerprints. If they don't belong to the family or investigators, whose are they? Fourth, the court reporter at Darlie's trial made an astonishing 33,000 errors in the trial transcript. 33,000. Some of Darlie's supporters argue these errors alone warrant a new trial. And fifth, at least one juror from her original trial has since said he believes they made the wrong decision. He's stated publicly that he thinks Darlie was wrongfully convicted. But the prosecution remains absolutely confident in their case. They tested over 100 DNA samples from the scene, and every single one belonged to Darlie or her children. The prosecutor, Greg Davis, now retired, has said flatly, the DNA testing isn't going to move the needle one way or the other. So what really happened on June 6, 1996? That's the question that has haunted this case for nearly 30 years. The prosecution's case was built entirely on physical evidence and forensic science. They had no confession. They had no eyewitnesses. They had no clear motive except speculation about financial problems and the stress of motherhood. What they had was blood spatter patterns, fiberglass residue, luminol evidence, and a staged crime scene. Darlie has never admitted to these crimes, not once in nearly 30 years on death row. She's maintained her innocence with unwavering consistency, even when offered plea bargains that would have spared her from death row. She's chosen to stay on death row rather than admit to something she insists she didn't do. Think about that. If you were guilty and facing execution, wouldn't you eventually crack? Wouldn't you eventually take a plea deal that gave you life in prison instead of death? But Darlie has never wavered. On the other hand, the physical evidence against her is overwhelming. The blood spatter on her nightshirt places the knife in her hand. The fiberglass on the bread knife proves someone inside the house cut that screen. The luminol evidence shows she cleaned up blood at the sink before police arrived. The lack of evidence for an intruder, no bloody footprints in the garage, no disturbance of the dust on the windowsill, no scent trail beyond the sock, all points to someone staging a break-in that never happened. The truth is, this case comes down to what you believe about forensic evidence. Do you trust blood spatter analysis? Do you believe the fiberglass residue on that knife is proof of staging? Do you think those unidentified fingerprints mean an intruder was present? Or do they have an innocent explanation? The forensic evidence that convicted Darlie was cutting edge for 1997. But forensic science has evolved significantly since then. Some of the techniques used in her trial, particularly blood spatter analysis, have come under scrutiny in recent years. Studies have shown that blood spatter interpretation isn't as exact as juries were once led to believe. It involves subjective judgment that different experts can interpret differently. But here's what we know for certain. 2 little boys were brutally ended that night. Devin and Damon Routier, who should have grown up to have their own families, their own dreams, their own lives, had everything stolen from them. They were 6 and 5 years old. Someone took a kitchen knife and stabbed them to death in their own home, in a place where they should have been safe. Whether that person was their mother or a stranger who vanished into the night, those boys deserve justice. And that's why this case refuses to die. Because on one side, you have people who believe an innocent woman has been sitting on death row for 3 decades, separated from her surviving son, convicted based on flawed forensic evidence, and a jury that was prejudiced against her. On the other side, you have people who believe a woman ended her own children's lives and then staged an elaborate cover-up, manipulating everyone with her performance of grief. Both scenarios are horrifying. Both are tragic. And only one can be true. Darlie Routier sits in her cell on death row, a model prisoner by all accounts, still insisting she's innocent. Her legal team continues to fight, hoping that advanced DNA testing will finally reveal the truth. The prosecution remains confident that they convicted the right person. And somewhere in Texas, Drake Routier, who was too young to remember that terrible night, lives with the knowledge that either his mother was wrongfully convicted of ending his brother's lives, or his mother actually did end his brother's lives. Either way, his entire family was destroyed before his first birthday. The blood evidence that sealed Darlie Routier's fate continues to be debated nearly 30 years later. It either tells the truth about what happened that night, or it's been misinterpreted in a way that convicted an innocent woman. We may never know which one is correct. But as DNA technology continues to advance, as testing continues on evidence from the crime scene, there's still a possibility that new information will emerge. Information that either confirms beyond any doubt that Darlie Routier is guilty, or proves that the justice system made a terrible mistake. Until then, the blood keeps telling 2 different stories. One points to a mother who did the unthinkable. The other points to an intruder who was never found. And after nearly 30 years of legal battles and public debate, we're still trying to figure out which story is true.